Welcome to The Investor, a podcast where I, Joel Palafinkel, your host, dives deep into the minds of the world's most influential institutional investors. In each episode, we sit down with an investor to hear about their journeys and how global markets are driving capital allocation. So join us on this journey as we explore these insights. All right. Welcome back to the Investor Podcast. Really excited for my guest today. I've got William Solomon with me. He's the Chief Investment Officer at White Manna Capital. He's a healthcare investment, which is a healthcare investment firm focused on artificial intelligence, biotechnology, longevity, obesity, and metabolic diseases, women's health, and pharmaceutical innovation. William Solomon brings over 20 years of leadership in the healthcare industry with an uncommon depth of pharmaceutical, clinical, and regulatory expertise. He has built and scaled multiple enterprises in the healthcare industry, including founding the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, also known as the ACMA, the leading board certification and accreditation organization with partnerships spanning over 1,000 pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies worldwide. As a recognized national thought leader, he is a frequent commentator on pharmaceutical innovation and healthcare policy, appearing regularly on Fox News, ABC, News Nation, and other major outlets. With an audience exceeding over 400,000 followers across all of his social media channels, he's widely regarded for his ability to distill complex science into clear, actionable insights for the market and for leaders across the industry. So, William, welcome to the show. Super excited to kind of unpack a lot of topics regarding healthcare and the future of technology as we see it.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, why don't we take a step back and maybe go through your early career, maybe talk about maybe getting into college and, thinking about where you wanted to, go in your career. And, you've evolved also as a really successful investment manager. But talk about kind of what was going on in your mind earlier in your career and how you kind of found your first step into entrepreneurship and building this career in the healthcare space.
Yeah, sure. So, when I was going to college, I went to NYU undergrad and Columbia for my grad school. And to be honest, when I was first going to school, I was thinking I was going to do something kind of right in the lab as a scientist working in the lab. But I realized quickly that I'm a people person. I like to be out there. I like the business side of science. That's really what's, of most interest to me. So when I left school, I did my background's in biochemistry. Once I left school, initially I was working in the lab, worked at M&M Mars, which is, as you guys know, the chocolate companies. I worked in the lab there, and then worked in academia, was a teacher, as a professor. And then I met a girl, and this girl was working in the pharmaceutical industry. We dated for a little bit. She's not my current wife, but we dated for a little bit. And she opened my eyes to pharma, and I learned a lot about the pharma industry from her. And that was really it. That opened, the gates to a whole new career path for me. And I worked in the pharmaceutical industry in an area called the medical affairs. So I was the guy in pharma who was running clinical trials, generating research and data, educating healthcare providers, running studies, things like that. So that was really what I did. And when I did that, I learned a lot about how pharma companies operate. And one of the things that I was shocked to find out, Joel, is that the pharmaceutical industry had no uniform standards for the pharma professionals that go out and educate and sell to doctors. So I developed it. So in 2015, I built a company called the ACMA, which now today operates in over 80 countries. We're the main accreditor and certifier of all the pharma professionals. We're also the people that when you go to a doctor's office or you go to a hospital, the people that do the billing that submit to the insurance company. We're the ones that actually certify and accredit those people. So built it out into a pretty interesting, business.
That's amazing. What were some of the biggest things that you learned building that business?
I learned it's hard to find good people. That's probably the number one thing I think as an entrepreneur. When you do find good people, you really want to make sure that you treat them well and that you build that level of loyalty to help expand and grow the business. That's probably the most difficult thing is really finding good people. I would say the second thing is being able to navigate and work with building the business and scaling it, but doing it in a way that's very cost effective, especially early on. You got to really be kind of counting nickels and dimes early on to make sure that you're not wasting money here and there. I think that's also very important. And the last thing I would say is be focused on the mission. Sometimes it's easy when you're building a company, like someone gives you an idea, you run this way, you go that way, but you got to learn to stay focused and not get too impulsive. So those definitely in the last 10 to 15 years, being an entrepreneur is something that I've learned.
That's amazing. Well, would love to learn a little more about, kind of the next step after that. What happened after building that business?
So after building that business, through by doing that, I kind of built out myself as a thought leader, and I got a lot of interest from media. So TV stations would reach out, radio would reach out, different news outlets, and said, "Hey, we want to get your opinion on this or that." And really, what kind of brought me to the forefront in the news and on media was the opioid crisis. So if you remember back in 2019, there was a big outbreak of stories about the fact that Americans were addicted to opioid drugs, and the pharma industry was, in some way fueling some of that by providing misinformation. Well, that put ACMA at the center because people said, "Hey, we need an ACMA."
Yeah.
And then it put me at the center in a good way. And so I kind of became the spokesperson and, for a lot of these issues. And once I built out that thought leadership, it opened up a lot of different avenues for me. And then about a year ago, I founded White Manna Capital, which is, like you mentioned at the outset of the program, it's a healthcare investment fund. We're a hedge fund that's focused on things in particular related to obesity, metabolic disease, women's health, AI, and its kind of interplay between that and healthcare. As you know, right now, one of the big things that's happening in science is we've made a lot of strides in the area of obesity, metabolic disease. And I think we're just at the start. The next 10 to 15 years are going to probably transform how we treat patients in terms of obesity and cardiovascular disease and things like that.
So I think it'd be really valuable to share some insight for emerging hedge fund managers. How should they think about building a strategy? What's the process? Usually it starts with, if you work at a, large hedge fund, you have, a bunch of research analysts that are coming up with investment ideas. It goes to a portfolio manager. So how can you actually build that? What are some things that you learned, and maybe some advice to people that are looking to kind of set up their hedge fund? Should they do back testing? Should they kind of do some paper trading in the beginning? Maybe some insight before they go institutional.
I think one of the most important things before you start, because the costs can add up, as you probably are aware.
Absolutely.
When you're starting a hedge fund. So if you're an emerging manager, your first time manager, and you're starting out, first make sure that you have some folks, some LPs that are potentially committed on board, right? Even if they're just, that there are folks that are willing to support you in the investment thesis that you have. I think that's really number one, very, very important. The same thing too, I think, is related to your team from an operational perspective. Really try to operate very lean when you're starting out, because obviously you don't want to spend tons and tons of money and have a quick burnout on a short runway. So that's really important as well.
Sure.
And then the third thing I would say is develop a thesis that is easy for investors to fit into a diversified portfolio. At the end of the day, this is a product for them. So how does your hedge fund, how does your investment vehicle kind of fit into their portfolio when they're looking at all their different types of investments, and it's something that they could easily understand. One of the things that we've done at White Manna Capital is the issue of obesity, women's health. It's a hot issue right now. It's at the beginning cusp of that in healthcare. It's kind of at an inflection point now. So for a lot of investors, they get it. They hear everything that's going on in the news about issues, longevity, all that stuff makes a lot of sense to them.
I mean, GLP is a really hot topic, and I've heard different comments across the board. There's, and you're going to know better than me, but I've heard there's some side effects with maybe even losing some bone density as a side effect. But would love to hear, maybe that's one of the topics we start with, just kind of your take on GLP and just your reaction to it, and what people are saying about it in the market, and especially as an investment. If you're building a hedge fund strategy, maybe some investment ideas to think about if you're allowed to share any.
Yeah, sure. So first I would say, why did I pick metabolic disease and obesity? When we think about obesity, it isn't just about the numbers on the scale. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
people take a GLP-1 for cosmetic reasons. They want to lose weight, but there's a lot more to that. The idea really, especially in the next 10 years, I think what's going to happen is pharmaceutical companies are going to look at these drugs and what it means to target organ damage.
Mm-hmm.
So when you lose weight, what does that mean to your heart? What does that mean to your liver? What does that mean to your kidneys? What does it mean to depression and even neurodegenerative disorders like, Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that? That's really where there's a lot of potential. So for investors, there's so much opportunity there because remember the baby boomers that were born in the 50s, that was a huge aging population. They're in their 70s.
Mm-hmm.
They want a better quality of life. They want longevity. So for them, they want to be able to undo some of the side effects of obesity, some of the effects of, having higher levels of cholesterol, poor diabetes control for many years. The future of the next generation GLP-1 drugs is going to address some of that. And that goes back to your point, because you're right. When you take a GLP-1 drug today, the first generation drugs, the Wegovy's, the Ozempics,
Mm-hmm.
the Zepbound, one of the problems is you lose a lot of lean muscle mass.
Yeah.
And as you know, right, if anybody listening out there works out, what are the big things you want to do, especially as you get over 40, is you want to be able to preserve lean muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of data to show that strength, especially grip strength, actually, is well correlated to mortality. So you don't want to have, even if you're losing weight, you don't want to lose lean muscle mass. And that can impact, like to your point, bone density. That can make you more prone to hip fractures. And we know that hip fractures are correlated to mortality in the first year, which means that if you're a 65-year-old and you lose weight and you get a hip fracture, in that first year, you just doubled your chance of dying.
Sure.
So getting a hip fracture is a big deal when you get older. Mm-hmm. So why do I bring that up is that, from an investment perspective now, there's a lot of companies out there, Structure Therapeutics, Viking Therapeutics, of course, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Amgen. There's a bunch of different companies, and I've talked about this before on television, that are great for investors to look at. They have a lot of potential opportunity because they're trying to address some of these issues in a different way. So some are coming about it mechanistically different. Instead of targeting GLP-1, they're targeting different things. So from an investment perspective, there's a lot of potential there. But in terms of, GLP-1s as a class product today, I think there's just going to continue to grow even with the first generation, because right now, the people that should be on the GLP-1, if I tell you the percentage that are actually on it, you'd be shocked. What I mean by that is that of all the people that could be eligible for a GLP-1, only like 6-7% of them are actually on the drug.
Yeah.
So we still
what about private markets? So we got, we see Serena Williams all the time now touting Roe, right? Roe is a company formerly known as Roman. They're essentially like a telehealth company, right? But you can buy GLP, and you see her all over, every single, Netflix or Amazon show that you're watching, you see one of her ads. But she's really, promoting that as one of the spokespeople. But that's private markets. So, as you're thinking about your public market strategy, there's a lot of hedge funds that have a crossover strategy. So they look at these private companies and potentially think about, hey, what could they come in at an entry point as, and potentially be an emerging idea that comes into your basket. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on just kind of these innovators that are coming in, where you can digitally kind of order things anonymously, and, obviously attracting the consumers with celebrities and spokespeople as influence. Just wanted to hear your take on that in terms of kind of like commoditizing that for like the mainstream.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yes, I'm familiar with Serena Williams and Roe and what they're doing there. I mean, that's a different issue. There's a medical issue there. There's an investment issue. I think from an investment perspective, I think those are great companies to look at, especially companies that are supporting a lot of the infrastructure behind dealing or addressing some of the side effects of GLP-1s. For example, a lot of the nutraceutical companies that are out there that are, putting together certain kinds of vitamin combinations to address some of the vitamin deficiency issues that happens because this electrolyte imbalance that occurs when you're on GLP-1s. I think that those are great companies to look at. Other companies to look at are a lot of the wearables. So companies where you're looking at CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, or looking at companies that can monitor blood pressure, heart rate, any of the wearables, because if you're going to have people on these medications, you're going to want the ability to be able to monitor different vitals and things like that. So I think that's a big one. So definitely healthcare infrastructure.
Yeah.
Wearables, I think, is a big one. Software, devices that have healthcare applications. And the last big one I would say is data. Companies that are leveraging AI or have great big data warehouses that are collecting a lot of data on these patients. Because here's the thing. Remember, these patients, and there's tens of millions of patients throughout the world that are on these medications. The data that we're collecting on these patients can help us in the future determine who's a better responder to therapy. And that's going to help us to determine from a precision medicine perspective who we should target. So if you're a company and you want to target people and you have that data, that's fantastic. That's going to be worth a lot of money to pharmaceutical companies.
So I want to hear your take on people self-diagnosing themselves using AI. They're worried about some type of diagnosis. They cut and paste that and put into ChatGPT. And, I've done this a few times. And the response I got in ChatGPT was the exact same response from the doctor. So my question is, maybe they came up with it on their own, but God knows if they're going behind the corner and actually typing in the same search as well, right? So I wanted to know your thoughts on that. And then that actually drives opportunity for companies like Function Health, right? Function Health, you pay a subscription, $400 a year, and you do your blood work and you just pay $400 a year and you get most of the answers that you need if you're moderately healthy. A lot of, there are practitioners that are on the platform, but, when's that going to converge, William, based on your thoughts?
It's a great question. My opinion is that in healthcare, especially, you always want that human oversight. You want that human at the last stage before a decision gets made. I think, with AI models as they are today, you're right. They're pretty good at being able to diagnose based on images and things like that. But we know that the models can hallucinate. So we got to be careful, I think, when it comes to treating patients. One of the examples that I could give is United Healthcare. Allegedly, about a year ago, actually, they were criticized heavily because they built an algorithm in their AI to basically deny patients access to medications. And, it is bad. That's not good, right? If patients are getting denied access to medications, that's a bad thing. But they purposely manipulated the AI. And so I think you gotta look at how is that AI model trained?
Sure.
What's the data that's involved?
What are the inputs? Garbage in, garbage out, right?
I was just about to say garbage in, garbage out. Exactly. I just think you got to be careful with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You talked about developing talent, retaining talent when you ran a business. What are some things that you look for when you're hiring maybe, an analyst or someone to join your team to kind of think through strategies, and what are the skills that you think they need to bring to the table to be a successful hedge fund manager at your firm?
Yeah. So we have an analyst team now, research analyst, we have a portfolio manager. And what I look for really is one thing. I look for people that have very, very strong work ethic. So they have, they usually, these people go to really good schools. That's great. We know that they're intelligent, they're book smart, but do they have the work ethic? To me, that's the number one thing, because the reality is, in today's market, and you know this, Joel, you can have access to information quickly. So that's not the issue.
Yeah.
The issue is, how do you distill it? Can you make sense of it? Can you critically interpret and understand it?
Sure.
So if you get an output from AI, do you know what it means? Like, can you apply it now to the business? I think that's what's more important in today's market.
What would you say are the technical skills and the soft skills needed to be a good, maybe entry-level hedge fund manager? And then maybe as a leader at a hedge fund, how do those evolve, those skills?
I think from a technical perspective, obviously understanding valuation models, how the markets operate, all that type of stuff, those are givens. But the soft skills are critical, right? Building relationships. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's I would say that's number one, right? Do you know how to build relationships? Do you know how to
Yeah.
present and communicate effectively? Can you articulate your story
Mm-hmm.
and why they should work? In our case, with White Manna Capital, what's the reason? What's your edge? What
Mm-hmm.
makes you different? Like when people ask me, okay, what's different about it about you guys? There's a bunch of healthcare hedge funds. What makes you guys different, right? And I always tell
Sure.
people, I wasn't just a pharma operator, but because of what we've done at the ACMA, that knowledge and that intelligence network of 1,000 pharma companies,
Mm-hmm.
we understand market access. We understand the payer landscape. So I could tell you with pretty good probability, even if a
Mm-hmm.
drug gets approved, whether it'll be successful in the market, because a drug can get approved. They can have good data, efficacy, and safety,
Yeah.
but it still may not be successful. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And that's not something you can find in Chat GPT. And so,
Mm-hmm.
that's like our story, right? Like that's the edge we have. We have an edge
Yeah.
that is very difficult to find in other healthcare funds. So what's your edge? Can you articulate that edge quickly?
Sure.
And do you have if people go and do, strong due diligence on you, hopefully they won't find anything in your closet that you're trying to hide. So I think operating with honesty, integrity is really, really, really important.
Yeah. And then as you develop as a leader, as a PM, kind of managing a team of, I would say, probably analysts, right? What are some of the skills that you have to evolve? I'm assuming leadership and communication are there, and then also kind of those same technical skills. But what actually elevates as you become a leader and you're building culture?
I think it's making sure everybody's aligned on the vision.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you want to go? If you're leading a team and they don't know where you want to go, they don't understand your vision,
Mm-hmm.
then everybody's moving in a different direction. So getting everybody together and aligned on here's the direction we're trying to go, so everybody
Yeah.
works in that direction. And that's just something I learned as an entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
for the last 10 to 15 years that I bring the White Manna Capital, as the hedge fund manager, is helping people understand this is our vision, this is the mission that
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to accomplish, this is why we're doing this. One of the big things that people don't
Mm-hmm.
talk about in the hedge fund world, but for me, one of the things that got me in the healthcare on this side of the fence is that we can actually use capital to drive interesting innovation that ultimately helps society, helps humanity, helps patients. I've talked to a lot of LPs who tell me that. It's like, look, as I'm getting older, I want to use my money to try to help make a better society. And healthcare is a great way to do that. Well, on top of the fact that healthcare right now in biotech pharma is a great way to head some of the volatility in AI. As you know, they're talking about the AI bubble.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain point where some of these institutional family offices, they can only spend so much money in a month, right? I mean, there's so many dinners that you can go to,
Yeah.
and so many homes that you can buy, right? I mean, there is a maximum capacity. So at some point, there's something else that's driving that, and some people just do it for the love of the game, the love of the sport of investing and winning, and being part of the market, right? Still being in the saddle. So I've seen that a lot too with a lot of the LPs that have come through our platform and community. Um, in terms of performance, as you're a fund manager, what are some things that emerging managers should think about in terms of key performance metrics when they're especially trying to get in front of LPs? A couple of ones that we often hear about is obviously the net annualized return, the alpha, the Sharpe ratio, the Sortino ratio, maximum drawdown, any other ones that are hot ratios, especially if you're trying to kind of showcase your performance, that you need to have on your pitch deck as you're kind of building those relationships.
I mean, I think you covered the major ones.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, helping also to explain from a portfolio perspective, what are some of your exposures look like, right? Your net
Mm-hmm.
exposures and things like that. I think that's important, and how you're determining what you're going to pick in the
Mm-hmm.
portfolio. How are you going about that? What's the process like?
Yeah.
How do you work with the PM? That's a question that comes up quite a bit when you're talking to investors.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to understand the process, and that there's good thought that's gone into it, right? And there's
Yeah.
good like quality checks back and forth. So I think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. For those that have studied for the CFA and taken the CFA, I believe there's still a whole volume on just portfolio theory. So just thinking through how you're rebalancing the portfolio and how you're weighting the portfolio, I feel like some of those disciplines are super important. So I don't know if you had any just guiding principles for just kind of portfolio theory and kind of putting together a strategy.
One of the things that I think is important is you don't want any one, mover in the portfolio to be more than 10% on average. I think for
Interesting.
me, that puts a lot of risk,
Mm-hmm.
in the portfolio. So as you're constructing it, again, you got to look at these types of things and make sure that you're mitigating some of that risk. I
Mm-hmm.
also think you can start out with a certain strategy, but obviously as you see the market change and shift,
Mm-hmm.
being flexible and vigilant and just looking at different ways that you can hedge maybe some volatility if you're bearish on the market or whatnot. So things like that, we've looked at that at White Manna Capital.
Mm-hmm.
And even though like I mentioned at the outset, we're primarily a long short fund, but we're open and looking at private equity deals in the space. A lot of people come to us because of our background. Like I mentioned,
Yeah.
I'm a PhD by background. My portfolio manager is actually an MD, he's a medical doctor,
Mm-hmm.
really smart guy, also Ivy League trained, had a lot of experience in the markets. So we get a lot of ideas like that. And I think especially in biotech and pharma,
Yeah.
you have to have that technical background. That's really
Mm-hmm.
important.
Yeah, no, I love that you have a PhD. I say, the concept of having a PhD. I did my doctorate too, and what you have to do at the end is you have to defend a thesis, essentially an
Yes.
idea that
Yeah.
nobody has done before, and you have to prove it with statistical significance. If you think about it, it's
Yes.
not too different or way off than essentially a hedge fund strategy, right? There's statistical analysis that you're looking at. You're looking at, a bunch of data from the past, and essentially you're proving it through your performance
Yes.
to make sure that it works. So I feel like a lot of times there's parallels in life with a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So I think that was, just kind of an interesting insight. One more topic that I think we've covered most of the topics, but there was one on women's health and longevity.
Yeah.
I want you to touch on menopause, longevity, and just preventative care. But a huge thing that I'm seeing often is thyroid treatment. Now there's some of these smaller companies that people can digitally connect with. But what I've seen is when you go through pregnancy, a lot of people do have thyroid issues, but it gets elevated when you go through pregnancy, and now your levels are completely off, and now you're kind of dealing with different side effects of that. Right, it might evolve to Hashimoto. Some people might have to do like a thyroidectomy. So just wanted to know if that's something that you're starting to see alongside an emerging trend, alongside the other emerging trends. But maybe you can just touch on that and your thoughts on that, and then just kind of just a couple bullets on just women's health and longevity.
Yeah, I haven't seen so much of that on the thyroid side.
Okay.
Although I have a pretty crazy story. I remember my wife was pregnant with one of our kids. Towards the end of the pregnancy, she went blind in one of her eyes out of
Jeez.
nowhere. We were obviously scared, rushed to the ER. They did an MRI of her head, and what they found was because she was pregnant, there was, I guess, a pituitary tumor. It's like a benign tumor in her head that grew because when you're pregnant, to your point, your hormones change.
Yeah.
The tumor actually grew, and it caused basically a compression on the nerve that's in the back of her eye. And it was very, very scary. But for women's health in general, what I would say is
Can some
now,
of that be treated non-invasively as well, or does it usually always have to be invasive? I guess it depends on the situation.
in that case, they just gave her, oral medication,
Yeah.
and they were able to shrink the tumor.
Yeah.
And then when she was when she had the baby, it went away.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, thyroid issues, and they're prevalent more in women generally because a lot of the hormonal changes and imbalances that occur, actually a lot of it due to diet, to be honest, as well. But what I was going to say about women's health was that similar to obesity, women's health has a lot of spokes. So women develop cardiovascular disease differently. Women are more prone to getting diabetes, especially when they get to perimenopause and menopause. They have a lot of bone density issues as well. They can develop osteoporosis, osteopenia. And women can have a lot of issues, again, from a neurological perspective. So right now for women, one of the biggest things, again, is how do I maintain high quality of life and that longevity into my 60s and early 70s, where I'm being able to maintain a good quality of life? And so there's a lot of interest in that. And I think that that's going to be continued, more interest in that area, because the truth is people are living longer on average, and women actually live longer on average than men.
Sure.
I want to say it's by about 5 years more on average.
That was really helpful. Well, I know we're at time, but I always like to end every podcast with just one piece of wisdom, William. So it could be a piece of wisdom from your entrepreneurial days. It could be just a piece of advice that you carried through with you from a family member, a colleague, or maybe a past mentor or a current mentor. So whatever you got with us, we'll take.
I would say the biggest thing is when people show you who they are, if it's employees, partners, whatever, when you first meet them, you should believe them. You've probably heard that before. That took me a while to really learn that. Sometimes we want to see what we want to see because we want to see the world a certain way. But when people show you who they are when you first meet them, you should take them for it. Take them at that point.
So give them a chance and kind of give them a chance to maybe prove you wrong, I guess, too, right?
Yeah. It could be good or bad, but it just, people at the beginning are a little more disarmed. And I think you just have to, you have to accept who they are. And that's hard sometimes. Yeah.
Well, appreciate all the helpful advice and insights, and love that nugget. I totally agree with it as well. So appreciate it. And love that love all the things that you're doing for the women's health sector and also for the investment management community. So appreciate it. And everybody else, have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye. And how global markets are driving capital allocation. So join us on this journey as we explore these insights.